Greetings, gentle observer, and welcome. I am RDF, and I thank you for watching my humble video, and I do so hope you will subscribe and press that all-important notification bell. Within this video we shall look at the danger to humanity posed by atmospheric carbon dioxide. Not in the context of mythical global warming, and not in the context of the climate alarmist claim that the Earth has too much atmospheric CO2, but rather in the reality that there is too little CO2 within the atmosphere, and here is where the real danger lies. Although CO2 has been demonised by the climate alarmists, I would remind you that CO2 is not poisonous, it is not toxic, and it is not a pollutant. In fact, life-giving CO2 is as vital to life on the planet as is oxygen, water and sunlight. For all terrestrial vegetation interacts with CO2 at a very basic level. And indeed, without CO2, plant life cannot survive. And the more CO2 there is in the atmosphere, the more vigorously plant life flourishes. Plants need a minimum concentration of CO2 within the atmosphere of 150 parts per million in order to survive. But alarmingly, at the end of the last glaciation, some 11,000 years ago, CO2 stood at just 180 parts per million, just 30 parts per million above the death of all terrestrial vegetation, and indeed the end of life on planet Earth. Thankfully, atmospheric CO2 rose slightly to 270 parts per million prior to the Industrial Revolution, and has since increased to the current level of 420 parts per million. But this level remains dangerously low. Whilst this small rise in life-giving CO2 levels has not affected global temperatures whatsoever, this increase in atmospheric CO2 is having a truly miraculous greening effect upon the whole planet, with vegetation now growing in areas that were arid wastelands not too long ago. This being so, then CO2 is something we would benefit from were there more CO2 in the atmosphere rather than less. It has been calculated, for example, that were levels of CO2 to be increased from the current level of 420 parts per million to 700 parts per million, this would have no effect whatsoever on global temperatures, but food production would increase by a staggering 46%. Of significance, past climatic records tell us that interglacial atmospheric CO2 stood, on average, at 2,600 parts per million, 6 times higher than today, meaning that today the Earth is CO2 deficient. Here I would mention that I am not a religious person in any way. However, were a religious person to claim that their particular God put fossil fuels and our industrial society here on Earth together, so that we would burn the fossil fuels and in so doing replenish life-giving atmospheric CO2, then I would be hard put to argue against this belief. For our continued burning of fossil fuels is helping to save the planet rather than destroying it, as the climate alarmists would have it. On CO2, the scientist Richard Lindzen said, and I quote, "What historians will definitely wonder in future centuries is how deeply flawed logic, obscured by shrewd and unrelenting propaganda, actually enabled a coalition of powerful special interests to convince nearly everyone in the world that carbon dioxide from human industry was a dangerous, planet-destroying toxin. It will be remembered as the greatest mass delusion in the history of the world. That carbon dioxide, the very life of plants, was considered for a time to be a deadly poison. End quote. If you would like more information as to how CO2 is turning the planet green, then please Google NASA and greening, and the NASA website documenting the CO2 greening effect will come up. As mentioned, CO2 is vital for all terrestrial vegetation and hence for all life itself. And I would remind you that should CO2 levels fall below 150 parts per million, all life on the planet would come to an end. Birds, fish, insects, amphibians and mammals, including us human beings, all would perish. Alarmingly, atmospheric CO2 levels have been falling for 140 million years, meaning that today the level of atmospheric CO2, and as mentioned, is dangerously low. And the reason for this continued decline lies with what I call the three sisters of the apocalypse. And I think you may be surprised to learn that these three deadly sisters are in fact chalk, limestone and marble. As you will no doubt recall from your school days, terrestrial life follows a recognised carbon cycle, whereby plants, for example, absorb atmospheric CO2 when growing and release this same CO2 back into the atmosphere when dead and decaying, thus providing CO2 for the next generation of plants. Many marine animals, however, act in a very different way indeed, for they absorb carbon from seawater, carbon that has been captured from the atmosphere, in order to grow protective armour in the form of shells. However, when these animals die, this captured carbon is not returned to the environment, as with terrestrial vegetation, but may well fall to the bottom of the ocean, where it might accumulate into thick beds over many, many years, eventually forming either chalk or limestone, and in so doing rob the earth of vital atmospheric CO2. Should limestone be subjected to heat and pressure within the earth, then it becomes the metamorphic stone, marble, the last of the three sisters of the apocalypse. When we look at the white cliffs of Dover, for example, or a limestone rock face, then these geological formations represent billions of tons of captured atmospheric CO2. Should this carbon capture and keep process continue, then in just 1 million years' time, all life on planet Earth will come to an end, as there will not be enough atmospheric CO2 in order to sustain life. As mentioned, the Industrial Revolution and our continued use of fossil fuels is helping to keep atmospheric CO2 from further decline, which in turn is helping to save the planet. We should, however, be looking at ways of releasing captured carbon, which can be done in several ways. One of which is the burning of limestone, for example, as this releases captured carbon back into the atmosphere. And indeed, this is already being done via the manufacture of cement, which produces 5% of worldwide CO2 emissions. More CO2 emissions, incidentally, from the manufacture of this one single product than is produced by the whole of the United Kingdom, as we produce just 4% of worldwide CO2 emissions. The supreme irony of this situation is that the climate alarmists actually want to reduce CO2, whereas we should be doing all we can to increase atmospheric CO2 and so safeguard the planet for future generations. I would mention that not all vegetation requires CO2 in order to survive, for I understand that certain microbial life forms can live without CO2 altogether. This being so, then if the climate alarmists get their way, and atmospheric CO2 is reduced to less than 150 parts per million, life on planet Earth may well consist of little more than a brown stain on a rock somewhere. In their ignorance, the climate alarmists really are playing with fire. I am RDF and I thank you for watching.